Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for participating the thematic track of the International Forum for Sustainable Asia and the Pacific, which we called ISAP. This is the very first session of the thematic track of ISAP. Till this Friday, we will have more than 10 thematic sessions will be organized on the different topics on sustainable development issues. We hope the thematic session will give you some inspiration and the action for transformative changes of sustainable future with and after the COVID. My name is Yatsuka Kataoka. I'm a joint program director of City Task Force of IJES. I'm doing the MC roles until in the half of the session. The focus of the session thematic track is how to strengthen the linkage of VNR and Vnr. VNR stands for Voluntary National Review, that is a part of the follow-up review mechanism of the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. 47 countries presented their VNRs at the 2020 High-Level Political Forum of the UN, out of which 26 were first time. And then in total, until now, 168 VNR were presented from the different national government. On the other hand, there is no such follow-up and review mechanism of SDGs at the local level. But some local government, regional governments voluntarily conducted a review of SDG implementation and published voluntary local review report. We call the VLR report. The first VLR was conducted by New York City and 3 Japanese cities, namely Shimokawa Town, Toyama City, and Kitakyushu City of Japan, and then followed by the Helsinki and other cities in 2019. Since then, the number of VLR and the interest to VLR has been growing among cities. I just established the VLR Labo, online platform VLR in March 2019, and currently about the 70 cities VLR's report is available on the lab. Both VLR and VNR are expected to facilitate mutual learning and implementation of the 2030 Agenda and its SDGs. In addition, VNR and VLR are also expected to serve as a tool to enhance SDG implementation on the ground by promoting multi-stakeholder participation, expanding mutual understanding and partnership among stakeholders. More and more VLR is conducted. The need to link the VNR and VLR has been pointed out to the international community to maximize effectiveness and benefits of the voluntary reviews. This session will discuss how the VLR and VNR should be linked, complement each and also complement each other to further enhance of SDG implementation. That is key for transform our society to be more sustainable, especially with and after the pandemic. So so now I would like to move on this program. But before that, I would like to ask participants for the collaboration. And then you see the screen. We are using pseudo to interact with the audience. You can ask questions and make comments in the sessions via Slido on the session webpage or by accessing to the Slido URL here, shown here, and then with your smartphone or PC or tablet. So we would like to make the session active, so your comments and the questions is welcomed from Slido. And now I would like to move on to the program. So first, we got the message from the UNDESA, Mr. Emerson. And then I would like to ask the Secretariat to show the video message from the Mr. Emerson.
Ladies and gentlemen, First of all, many thanks to the International Forum for Sustainable Asia and the Pacific for the kind invitation for us to join this event. As the Secretariat of the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, UNDESA is deeply committed to ensuring robust monitoring and review of progress of SDG implementation at all levels. In this spirit, we're extremely happy to see the voluntary local reviews are picking up pace and that Japanese cities such as the town of Shimokawa, cities of Kitakyushu, Toyama, and Hamamatsu serve as the front runners of this movement. As we know, cities and regions are often the engines of innovation, and the achievement of many of the SDGs targets will truly lie on their shoulders. While the voluntary local reviews are not directly mandated by the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, these reviews can help cities and regions to update and transform their SDG implementation. They can also serve as a remarkable collection of concrete examples of actions and policies that have worked for all other actors to learn from. Colleagues, while there is no official format for the voluntary local reviews, we have learned from the national processes that certain shared elements drawing from the 2030 Agenda itself can enrich the peer learning and contribute to the robustness of the reviews. Hence, UNDESA has developed a set of global guiding elements for the voluntary local reviews, which draw from the Secretary General's common voluntary guidelines for the voluntary national reviews. These have been made available online. These elements merely aim at providing a proposed shared structure for the reports and at minimum give a checklist of issues that could be reflected in the process, even if they are not showcased in the report itself. The elements are not meant as restrictions to the process, but rather as a tool for those engaging in these reviews. These elements provide global overall guidance, which is being complemented by more detailed, in-depth regional and thematic guidance from other entities working to support these reviews. They are fully compatible with the Asia-Pacific regional guidelines on voluntary local reviews produced by our colleagues at the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, as well as the guidance provided by the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. These global guiding elements also aim at fostering a dialogue between the voluntary national reviews and the voluntary local reviews where applicable. On this issue, as the Secretariat of the High-Level Political Forum, we are very happy to see more and more national level reviews refer to meaningful collaboration with subnational governments and to these voluntary local reviews. In our minds, these reviews at two levels hold the potential to truly foster collaboration, coordination, and coherent action between national and subnational levels. They will also give us a much fuller picture of where we are in terms of our SDG implementation and where our challenges lie. As stated in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the national governments hold the primary responsibility for follow-up and review of progress towards the SDGs. The voluntary national review is a state-led process, and each member formulates their process and the report in a way that most effectively supports its own SDG implementation efforts. However, the voluntary local reviews can help the national governments fulfill two of the basic tenets of follow-up and review as set out in the 2030 Agenda. First, the 2030 Agenda calls for review processes that are open, inclusive, participatory, and transparent for all people that support the reporting by all relevant stakeholders. Voluntary local reviews fulfill this call in themselves, but they can also ensure participation of a number of actors at the local level that could not be otherwise reached by the national governments. Second, the 2030 Agenda calls for a robust and effective review framework. Here, cities and regions conducting the reviews can provide evidence-based analysis of the gaps, challenges, and opportunities our communities are facing when implementing the SDGs. Work done by cities and regions and these voluntary local reviews also hold true potential for fulfilling the promise of leaving no one behind. These voluntary local reviews can help identify at a granular level those communities and vulnerable groups that require additional support and enhance community engagement in finding solutions that work in that particular context. Due to these benefits, we were very happy to hear also several countries planning their voluntary national reviews for 2021 refer to the work of cities and regions at our first global workshop with member states 2 weeks ago. UNDESA has indeed, from the start, supported the voluntary national reviews and organized peer learning workshops for the countries participating in this process annually. We have noticed that the best experts in the process are those who have gone through the full cycle themselves or are preparing their reports. This is why we wish to hold similar workshops for our colleagues working at the subnational level. We held the first global capacity building workshop online in June, when we brought together cities and regions that have already conducted a voluntary local review to share their experiences with those only starting the journey. We also had colleagues working for the national governments share their experiences from the voluntary national review processes. This fall, we are organizing a series of thematic workshops on different aspects of these reviews. We just recently held the first workshop on stakeholder engagement, and the next event on incorporating the SDGs into strategies, plans, and budgets will take place on 19th of November. We would like to welcome all interested cities and regions to join us in these workshops. To close, I would like to encourage all cities and regions embarking on these reviews to make an honest effort in reflecting their SDG implementation in an open and sincere manner. The best marketing tool for the voluntary local review movement and its collaboration with the national governments will be added value these reviews can bring to the table. We look forward to working together with all interested entities in ensuring that the voluntary local reviews fulfill their promise as a flexible and useful tool for reviewing the SDG implementation for cities and regions around the world, and that the lessons learned in cities and regions are shared also at the national, regional, and global levels. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a video message from Dr. Emerson Shimbanda, Chief of National Strategy and Capacity Building Branch Division for the UNDESA. Thank you very much, Dr. Emerson. He pointed out the importance of the VLR as a mutual learning, also the encouraging the communication of the national and local level. On the monitoring, reporting, and implementation of the SDGs. So it's kind of impressive that UNDESA provides some the capacity development opportunities through workshop, not only for the national but the local level. So now I would like to move on to the framing presentation of my colleague, Dr. Eric Zassman, Research Leader of the Sustainable Governance Center. Thank you. Eric, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Kataoka-san, and thank you very much, colleagues, for allowing me to provide this framing presentation. The presentation will reflect on this core theme of strengthening the linkages between voluntary local reviews and voluntary national reviews. And as Kataoka-san mentioned, I am the research director at our Sustainability Governance Center. So to begin with, I think it's useful to share my screen and do that. Okay. To begin with, I think it's useful to illustrate what we're talking about when we think about the linkages between voluntary national reviews and the voluntary local reviews. And this is neatly illustrated by this diagram right here, where we highlight the fact that with the passage of the SDGs in 2015, there's been a gradually ongoing effort to vertically integrate these SDGs into local governments' actions, budgeting, monitoring processes, and what have you. And so there's very much a vertical dimension to this that's moving actually from the international level all the way down to the national, local, and in some cases, community level. What I want to also highlight, in addition to this vertical integration, which I think is essential to achieving the SDGs, is simultaneously there's also other dimensions of integration or engagement that are ongoing that can also help to support this vertical integration. And I'll talk briefly about horizontal integration, working across different sectors and issues, as well as stakeholder engagement, working with different stakeholders. This diagram we frequently at IGES, we call this multi-level, multi-stakeholder governance. But the point that I want to underline in the context of this presentation is all three of these dimensions are essential for achieving the SDGs, and the vertical and horizontal and stakeholder engagement are potentially mutually reinforcing. Now, the next point I'd like to highlight is when we think about this vertical integration and strengthening the linkages between the VNRs and the VLRs, this is not necessarily a new issue or a new set of problems. In fact, in the area where I've done most of my research on governance and political science, we've noticed for a long time there's been a gradual process to share more and more responsibilities with local governments. And what we've noticed, I mean, this is a perhaps overly simplified metaphor here, but what we've noticed in many countries is we've moved from a system which we call sort of dual federalism, or sometimes layer cake federalism, to one which is more of cooperative federalism or marble cake federalism. And what I mean by this is that there's a more and more sharing of powers between national and local governments. And frequently what's been happening actually is a lot of times national governments, as they take on more responsibilities, they recognize that local governments have some of the best and perhaps most innovative solutions to some of these new responsibilities, especially some of the things covered under the SDGs. And so they devolve some of the authority to handle these things. And in some cases, they also provide additional resources to do that, financial resources. In some cases, they've also promoted reforms that engage different stakeholders to help either promote and sometimes also put pressure on local governments to achieve these things. So as we move from this sort of layer cake to this marble cake type of federalism, this is a really important aspect that we need to consider when we think about linkages between the VNRs and the VLRs. Okay, now I'm going to briefly just discuss this in the context of the United States. This happens to be the country where I'm from, but I would suggest to you that in many countries, similar types of dynamics are underway. And to put sort of a spotlight on this, I'd like to just briefly share a snapshot of the history of this federalism in the United States. So what we saw happen in the US is, especially after the Great Depression in the 1930s, is governments taking on new responsibilities, whether this be healthcare or protecting forests. There was an expansion of the role of government. And with that expansion of the role of government, as mentioned previously, national governments recognized that sometimes local governments were better at doing things than they could potentially do themselves. And so they would delegate new responsibilities to local governments. And so between the 1930s and 1980s, we went from a situation where, again, we had this layer cake to sort of more marble cake type of federalism. Now, what would happen in the 1980s, in this period we'd call the sort of new federalism, is that there would be growing emphasis on allocating resources to help governments achieve some of these new responsibilities. Sometimes these allocations would be in the forms of what are called block grants. Sometimes they would be in the forms of allowing local governments to retain a greater share of tax revenue. So there would be more fiscal resources provided to help achieve some of these responsibilities. But gradually from the 2000s and moving forward, what we've also seen happen is a growing emphasis on what we call unfunded mandates. These unfunded mandates are the type of situation where the national government says to a local government, you need to be responsible for reducing pollution, but we're not necessarily going to provide you more resources to do that. And so this next graph right here shows these for local governments, but also some of the governance reforms that will help bring resources to local governments to help deal with some of these unfunded mandates. And last but not least, there's also some conceptual frameworks out there that can help local governments as they begin to vertically integrate the SDGs. These include things like a circulating ecological sphere, co-benefits approaches, landscape approaches. All of these work across different issues and bring in different stakeholders. And I think that can also help to strengthen the vertical dimension of this integration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for Eric for the very overall, concept of vertical integration of the local and national. Then I move on to the presentation from two distinguished guests from Europe. Thank you very much for the speakers, to participate in this meeting, although it is early in the morning. So I would like to introduce the first speaker, Mr. Eduardo Biewski, Director of Research and Intelligence, United Cities and Local Governments. We call it UCLG. So he is a kind of key person to the major publication of UCLG, and including the VLR things. So the Eduardo-san, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can. Thank you very much, Fernanda, to introduce me. I would like to first to thank ISAP and IGES for inviting me to speak at this conference and to introduce UCLG. As probably many of you know, UCLG gathered local governments associations, cities and regions from more than 140 countries. Our Asia Pacific section is UCLG ASPAC, and we have a Japanese member, Amamatsu, the city of Amamatsu. UCLG is strongly committed to SDGs. As you requested, I will focus my intervention on our efforts to support the localization of the SDGs and the reporting process. Next, please. I will approach four different dimensions. Next slide, please. The first one is our annual efforts to report to the HLPF. The second one is our support to the development of voluntary local reviews. The third dimension is our initiative on voluntary subnational reviews, and then our reflections on how to strengthen the links between subnational reporting and the Vnrs. Next slide, please. As you know, the High-Level Political Forum is the annual space for the assessment of the progress made in the implementation of the Agenda 2030. Since 2017, we coordinate the global report of local governments to the HLPF. That's called Toward the Localization of the SDGs. You can see it on the right of the screen. For annual reports, we already presented to the HLPF. But in November 2019, we dedicated the UCLG triennial report called Goal 5 report to the localization of the global agendas. This report presents the more detailed, ambitious revision of the progress made in the implementation of the SDGs at subnational level, region by region. In the framework of the HLPF, we also co-organize every year in partnership with UNDESA and UN Habitat the Forum of Local and Regional Governments to facilitate the reporting process of local governments. The aim of this reporting effort is to promote awareness raising and ensure an inclusive monitoring and reporting process that fosters the dialogue at international, national, and local levels. As shown in our reports and reflected in the map you have in the center of the slide, the global movement for localization of the SDGs has been growing. Our report to the HLPF shows that local and regional governments' involvement in the national voluntary national reviews processes has increased. Their participation grew from involvement in 23% of the countries that reported in 2016 to 55% in 2020. Next slide, please. Additionally, our report points to an increase in the elaboration of voluntary local reviews, with more than 50 cities and regions involved in all the continent, as is shown in the map on the right of the screen. In November 2019, we created the Community of Practice on VLRs with a core of 4 of our members. Its aim is to facilitate knowledge exchange and to identify and promote innovative approach. During the first semester 2020, we published a guidelines for voluntary local reviews in partnership with UN Habitat. In fact, this publication coincides with a similar one made by IGES. The aim of the first guidelines was not to propose a VLR template, but rather we wanted to study the process behind existing VLRs. The guidelines explore 4 key variables to take account of the diversity of 40 VLRs. The 4 variables, you see it at the center of the screen, is first, who is involved in the development of the VLRs. There is a significant diversity in the offices or agencies that are the key drivers of the process. The second variable or dimension is where the VLRs are located in the national institutional framework. And there are very few examples of VLRs being directly linked to national reviewing process, with the exception maybe of Japan and Finland. The third dimension is what is the content of the VLRs. Some review all 17 SDGs. Others have picked those SDGs for which they have information available. And the fourth dimension is how is the VLRs made? Issues with data management collection and the availability of resources are still big challenges for local governments. I would like to let you know that the guidelines are the first of a series, and the second volume will be focused on the links between voluntary local reviews and voluntary national reviews. Next slide, please. In 2020, UCLG launched a new approach. We proposed 6 pilot countries reporting in July 2020 to develop voluntary sub-national reports. These countries are Benin, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Kenya, Mozambique, and Nepal. We wanted to go beyond individual cities reporting efforts represented by the VLRs to develop a bottom-up country-wide approach from local governance point of view. This means to promote local governance reporting efforts that embrace the situation of a majority of subnational governments in a country, big, middle-sized, and small cities, regions, and provinces. We wanted to make sure that the subnational reporting will fit into the national voluntary national review process. And the experience has been quite successful. The majority of the 6 pilot countries integrated in their VNRs concrete reference to the subnational governance reports. Therefore, the BSR ensures an active and visible participation of local and regional governments and their associations in their country VNRs. It developed a critical analysis at the national strategies for the localization of the SDGs, as well as an assessment of the enabling institutional environment for LRGs, for local governments. We are quite optimistic that both voluntary local reviews and voluntary subnational reviews will contribute to increase the involvement of local governments in the national as well as in international reporting process. Next slide, please. To conclude, based on these experiences, to support local governments reporting at local, national, and international level, we identify key dimensions that can contribute to the involvement of local governments in the reporting process. The first dimension I will call galvanize the forces for the localization of the Agenda 2030 and for local monitoring processes. That means support local governments associations and networks to disseminate the SDGs, promote peer-to-peer exchange and learning, incentivize the mainstreaming of the SDGs as a reference framework for local policies, planning, and programs, and promote different local reporting modalities. The second dimension is create a national enabling institutional environment and strategies for the localization of the SDGs. A robust national localization strategy, well integrated into the national SDGs implementation plan, is a critical level, as well as an enabling institutional environment to catalyze local governments' engagement and encourage innovation for the localization. Then mainstreaming the SDGs into national and local budgeting process, supported by adequate incentives. Finally, the third dimension is improved multi-level governance. Strengthen local and regional governance voices in the voluntary national review. And finally, effective involvement of all spheres of government in the national coordination mechanism to strengthen the governance of the SDGs and the localization processes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eduardo, for the showing the overview of the progress of the localization SDG and VLRs. And then UCLG's publication is very informative on this field, and also UCLG is always leading the discussion on localizing SDGs. So we are happy to working with you always. And then also thank you very much for pointing out some possible points of interaction of VLRs, Vnrs. Thank you very much. And then I would like to introduce the next speaker, Mr. Sami Pilkala, the counselor and chief specialist, Sustainable Development and the 2030 Agenda Strategy Department of the Prime Minister Office of Finland. He is a key person of the Voluntary National Review preparation of the Finland. Finland has produced the second VNR in 2020 High-Level Political Forum. He is also very knowledgeable for the review process in the EU side. So Mr. Pilkala, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning from Finland. And thank you for the IGES for inviting Finland to this session on VLRs. We are very happy to participate. Also, thank you for the previous speakers for their excellent presentations. My presentation is very practical in nature. I will first tell you a bit about the Vnr process in Finland, how we have prepared our national reports, and then about the linkages between Vnr and local reports made in Finland by 3 cities this far, and yes, and what is the linkage more generally between local and national level. Okay, so could you please put the next slide? Yes, so I will first start by saying something about the Vnr process. So Finland presented its second national reports in this July at the HLPF. We made our first report in 2016, so 4 years ago. And so this was already our second report to the UN. And it was built on existing institutional follow-up and monitoring mechanisms we have in Finland, and also on studies and an external evaluation we have prepared since the first report. Our first report in 2016 was very much about the starting point of Finland. Where were we when the 2030 agenda was negotiated and adopted by the UN, and what were our strengths and what were our weaknesses, and what kind of structures we had for the implementation of the 2030 agenda. The first report was about explaining these structures and our starting point. And then the second VNR in 2020 was then focusing on the progress we had made as a country in 4 years since 2016. So in this second report, we go through our progress SDG by SDG, and explain what is the situation of Finland, what have been our key successes in these 4 years, what are our key challenges, and also a few words about what are we planning to do next on each SDG. We made this second report in a way that in many different ways involved stakeholders, the Finnish stakeholders. And maybe if you now look at our report, the main thing you will see is that for each SDG, there are two assessments. If you open one page, on the left-hand side, you can see the assessment of the government officials on where we stand as Finland. And then on the right-hand side, you will see the assessment of the Finnish civil society on where we stand on this SDG. And these assessments of the civil society were made independently by the civil society actors. There were more than 50 civil society organizations involved in the preparation of those assessments, different organizations for different SDGs. And we feel that this was a very, very good process. It brought us into many good internal discussions, and also the end result is quite nice. There are some differences in views of the government and in views of the civil society, but all in all, we can see that in many issues, we are on the same page. We agree on the issues and on our challenges between the government and between the civil society. And then also to this second VNR, we included some specific chapters on specific themes that were written by the stakeholders. And then also we organized a peer dialogue with the governments of Mozambique and Switzerland. That was to get some feedback to the preparation of our report, and also to hear their views on our report and how they were preparing their own reports, which were also presented. At least Mozambique did it. Next slide, please. Yes. So a few lessons learned from the preparation of this second report. First of all, we feel that the main issue is that there must be a mutual trust between and respect between the civil society and the government actors for a genuine involvement of civil society. And also there need to be a readiness to accept different kinds of opinions from the civil society. And I was when we were preparing our report, I discussed with a colleague from another country, and he asked me when I explained what we are doing, that we are asking the civil society to give their assessment, and then we are making our government assessment. And then he asked me, how will you then put these two assessments together to make one final assessment? And I needed to explain to him that we are not trying to make one final assessment, but we are just accepting the fact that there are some differences in opinion and different kind of assessments from the side of civil society and from the side of the government. So it was very important to kind of have this trust on civil society and their ability to make assessment which was based on evidence, which they did perfectly well. Then another issue we discussed a lot internally was how to summarize most important issues for progress, because as you all know, the 2030 agenda is such a vast agenda. There are many issues, and you somehow would need to pick up some key points from all that. And we ended up putting a key changes, lessons learned a box in the beginning of each chapter in our report. And in the end, we thought that was quite a nice way to summarize the key findings. And then just one more point about data gaps. And we also found out still 5 years from the adoption of the agenda, that even in Finland we have many data gaps, and we need to work on our national data as well as with the global data, as we all know that there is many significant gaps on global data on SDGs. And the timing was one issue for us as well. We are making national implementation plans for the government, and then we are making VNRs for the UN. And this time, those both happen to be under preparation at the same time, and that was a bit difficult. So next time, we will give our VNR to the UN 1 year later than we prepare our national implementation plan or update the national implementation plan. And next slide, please. And here you can see the front page of our report and the and also the statistical annex to our report that we prepared. Actually, there are 2 statistical annexes. You can find those from the UN website. And also, if you are interested, there is a short 3-minute video about the preparation of our report, and there's a link to that video on the left-hand corner of the screen. Next slide, please. Then just few points about the linkages between VNRs and VLRs. First of all, the governments have the responsibility for the implementation of the 2030 agenda. I think this is a very important point to make because the agenda 2030 was adopted by the governments, and we need to be clear about the fact that the governments need to implement the agenda on a national level. But of course, at the same time, we all know that main part of the SDG implementation is done in cities and municipalities. Cities in Finland and in many countries are responsible for the organization of education, healthcare, urban planning, energy production, and so forth. And these are issues that are of key relevance for the SDG implementation. So clearly, cities have a key role in the implementation. So what would then the governments need to do when we think about the situation that the responsibility is on the government, but many issues take place at the local level? In my view, the government has at least a dual role. The governments need to act as enablers, make sure that cities and municipalities have resources and tools for the implementation of the 2030 agenda, and also help the cities to exchange best practices on those issues and support cities in developing new ways of dealing with the implementation issues. And then, on the other hand, governments need to lead the way by clearly setting the goals and policies that promote sustainable development at country level. For example, in Finland, the government has decided to make Finland carbon neutral by 2035, and this sends a clear signal to all Finnish cities that they also need to do their share and participate on that work. And this is just one example, but in many ways, the governments need to set the national targets and clearly indicate to cities what to do. And then my last slide, could you put it please? This is about the VLRs in Finland. So by now, there are 3 Finnish cities, Helsinki in 2019, and then Turku and Espoo in 2020, who have made their VLRs. And there are more cities planning to do it for 2021 and 2022. And we have active cooperation between the government and cities, and also between the cities. And I think the cooperation between cities is even more active than the cooperation between the government and cities. So there's a lot of exchange of good practices between cities. And there are quite clear guidelines for the preparation of VNRs, but there are no such clear guidelines for the preparation of voluntary local reviews. And I think this is a possibility for cities to make such a VLR that really benefits the city most. even in Finland, even though the cities are quite similar in their nature, their VLR reports are very different, organized in a different way and focusing on different issues. And I think that's a strength. That's a strength for cities. And if a city is making a VLR, it should be such a VLR that it really helps the city. And I spoke quite a lot about stakeholder involvement on a national level, but it is at least as important or even more important at local level to involve local stakeholders to the preparation of the VLR and really take advantage of the VLR for involving local people, local communities to the SDG implementation work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sami. It's very nice to hear the experience of Vnr process in Finland. There are lots of things to learn. The first peer review with other countries on Vnr preparation. Also stakeholder engagement, very wide range and also practical the involvement of the stakeholders in the process. Also it is interesting to hear somehow working with stakeholders to fill in the gap of the data things. That is very important for the monitoring and evaluation of the SDG progress. And also and then at the high-level political forum in June, I participated in some online, session on VNR of Finland, also VLRs. And then it's very interesting. Many stakeholders participate in the speaking at the sessions, and then also they are very proud of the VNR with the stakeholder engagement. So thank you very much. And then Eduardo and Sami will participate in the panel discussion, so we can hear more about their expertise in the panel discussion. So now I would like to move on to the panel discussions. The panel will be moderated by my colleague, Dr. Junichi Fujino, Program Director of the City Task Force. So Fujino-san, floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Kataoka-san, and thank you for all the presentation. It's quite interesting and quite exciting. Yeah, thank you. For the panel, I'd like to invite also the very interesting presentation first, and then we'd like to have the discussion. So I'd like to invite the UNSCAP Sami-san. So we have two Sami-san for this panel. Mr. Samiuddin Ahmed from the UNSCAP, United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. Yeah, it's quite good to synergy with our ISAP, International Forum for Sustainable Asia and the Pacific. So for ideas, and also congratulations for your new report. So I'm very much looking forward to your story. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Junichi-san. It's a thank you also to IGES for inviting ESCAP to speak in this forum. It's a real pleasure for me to be speaking to you on the topic of strengthening VNR and VLR integration. If I can have my slides up on the screen, please. Thank you so much. If you can move on to the first slide, I just have a couple of slides elaborating on the recently launched Asia Pacific Regional Guidelines on Voluntary Local Reviews, and on how we are proposing in this guideline of strengthening and operationalizing VLR VNR integration. So as you can see, the VLR VNR integration is really a key focus of the recently launched Asia Pacific Regional Guidelines on Voluntary Local Reviews. So this guideline really builds on existing resources produced by UCLG, as we just heard, as well as other organizations such as IGES, Brookings Institution, and others. The guidelines were developed by ESCAP together with the Penang Platform for Sustainable Urbanization, of which UCLG ASPEC, IGES, UN Habitat, UNDP, and a few other organizations are a member of. And it's really the first VLR-focused knowledge product that takes into account the specificities of a particular region. Now, we have designed it to be relatively simple and straightforward. The guidelines contain useful examples, checklists, and templates so that it can be a very practical addition to any local policymaker's VLR toolkit. We have tried to keep it as holistic as possible. The guidelines, they introduce the 2030 agenda to the readers, discusses key concepts and the process of conducting a VLR. And it also contains useful information on how to develop the VLR report and what to do afterwards. While developing the guideline, we have also been mindful of the demands that have come up from regional stakeholders over the last few years, particularly around horizontal and vertical policy coherence. And that is why we have dedicated an entire chapter that focuses on strengthening VLR-VNR integration. And this is, as mentioned, it's a relatively new publication launched just a week ago on the 30th of October in line with the regional commemoration of World Cities Day. Next slide, please. Now, diving straight in, recent VNRs from the region have showcased many subnational government-led best practices around the SDGs. And these VNRs also highlight 4 actions that can form the basis for effective VLR-VNR integration. So the first set of actions that we see, if you look at the one on the left, the top-down actions, they take place at the national level when the national government really fully integrates the findings, data, and information collected from VLRs within the VNR and uses the VLR to engage wider and more diverse stakeholders as part of the local consultation process within the overall VNR process. Now, this requires national governments to proactively reach out to subnational governments conducting VLRs and can serve as an incentive to generate the political will to engage with the SDGs and potentially mobilize resources to conduct a VLR as well. The second set of actions, the bottom-up actions, take place at the local level when subnational governments use previous VNRs, if available, as a reference to develop their VLR and actively pursue the VLR process as an avenue of addressing structural issues that they face, but don't really have the mandate to respond to. Now, this requires subnational governments to not to limit the VLRs as simply follow-up and review process, but to expand the scope to intentionally identify instances of coherence and inconsistency between local and national policy frameworks and include structural issues that have to be addressed at the local level. Next slide, please. Now, the guidelines suggest actions that national and local government authorities can consider when trying to integrate the two processes. So, for example, firstly, we have the setting up of a national mechanism to support and consolidate the VLRs. So the national government can first identify an appropriate focal point for communicating and working together with subnational governments to set up such a mechanism. National associations of local governments, if they exist in countries, could also be mobilized to support this. And when there is no such association, the national government might have to choose some subnational government representatives. Second is designing and communicating the VNR timetable to allow subnational governments to submit VLRs that actually inform the VNRs. So the national government often informs the UN of its intention to carry out a VNR at a very early stage of the process. And national and local stakeholders are sometimes not aware of the timetable. So an ideal scenario would be when subnational governments are fully aware of the timetable and the national government consults them in a manner that allows for in-depth, meaningful feedback to be submitted into the VNR process. And once again, having a national mechanism to coordinate the process and consolidate the feedback would be greatly beneficial. And third, just designing the VNRs and the VLRs as an interconnected stakeholder engagement mechanism. So this would allow both national and subnational governments to reap the benefits of deeper integration. National governments, instead of passively waiting for subnational governments to conduct a VLR, can take steps to enable such processes to be an integral part of the VNR and bring on board different stakeholder groups at the respective localities. So for subnational governments, such a multi-stakeholder, territory-based approach would really enhance the validity, depth, and legitimacy of the VLR. Next slide, please. And that's it. Very short presentation from my end. We have the QR code and the link to the recently launched VLR guidelines up on the screen for you to scan. We do invite everyone to have a look at the guidelines, utilize them if possible. We have received quite a bit of interest from cities in the region, 8 cities so far who are interested in piloting these guidelines in the coming months and conducting a VLR. So we look forward to everyone's support as we support these cities also to conduct their VLRs going forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sami-san from UNSCAP. And I definitely want to use this guideline for Fukushima for review and then reporting. Yeah, thank you very much. So then next, I'd like to invite also a very important player for this VLR-Vnr linkage, Mr. Atsushi Morita from MOFA, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Japan. So floor is yours. Over to you.
Thank you, Fujina-san. And at the outset, I'd like to express my sincere appreciation to IGES for inviting me to this event. And also, I'd like to thank all the previous speakers for giving very insightful presentations. Let me first share my presentation. Okay. First of all, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the vulnerability of the international community. The coronavirus is posing a threat to the lives, livelihoods, and dignity of people across the globe. And this pandemic is indeed a human security crisis. In order to overcome the crisis, leaving no one behind must be a guiding principle for us. Looking forward, we need to build back better from the COVID-19 pandemic and create a flexible yet resilient society where the SDGs have been achieved and the virtuous cycle of environment and growth is generated. In order to achieve such a society, we need to spread the SDGs widely throughout the country. As Mr. Pirukara mentioned in his presentation, the governments have the responsibility to implement 2030 agenda, but local governments have very important roles to play. To this end, it is important to incorporate the SDGs into strategies and policies, not only of the government, but also of local governments. The Japanese government established the SDGs promotion headquarters in May 2016, headed by the Prime Minister, to ensure a whole of government approach to implement the 2030 agenda. And it formulated the SDGs implementation guiding principles as a mid to long-term national strategy for achieving the SDGs in Japan and internationally by 2030. In the current implementation guiding principles, which was revised last December, the Japanese government expects local governments to take actions such as establishing cross-departmental promotion organizations, developing a system of administration reflecting SDG elements in various plans, establishing governance methods to manage progress, accurately measuring SDG initiatives to disseminate information and share results, promoting cooperation with stakeholders both in Japan and overseas, and setting local indicators. Currently, municipalities of Japan are grappling with issues such as declining population and shrinking regional economy. We believe contributing to promote the SDGs can lead to local revitalization, and it will inevitably contribute to resolve those regional challenges. Therefore, the Japanese government raises SDGs-driven regional revitalization as one of the 3 pillars of its action plan on the SDGs, and encourages the local governments to take actions on the SDGs through initiatives such as Japan SDGs Award and SDGs Future Cities. Gradually, the number of local governments which take actions on SDGs is growing, but I believe spreading the idea and movement of the Voluntary Local Review, VLR, will promote further actions. In the implementation guiding principle, the Japanese government encourages local governments to actively implement VLRs. We believe through drafting VLR, local governments will take further actions on the SDGs and re-evaluate them, and the cooperation among municipalities, regional blocks can be enhanced. It is also expected to further promote the resolution of regional issues through the construction of a cooperative framework between regional level officials, citizens, and multiple stakeholders. We highly commend efforts of those local governments which already submitted VLRs, and look forward to see further VLRs from local governments of Japan and other countries. This year marks year 1 of the decade of action towards the achievement of the SDGs. The notion of leaving no one behind, which symbolizes the SDGs, should be the guiding principle for designing our society for the future. The Japanese government will redouble its efforts to achieve the SDGs together with its local governments, civil societies, and the international community. I will close my remarks here and look forward to discuss further after hearing from other panelists. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Morita-san, for sharing the Japanese government's effort to, develop the SDGs in the real. Now SDG is quite popular, and many people have this badge, and so it's because of the good effort by the Japanese government and all the stakeholders. Thank you very much. Okay, then last but not least, I'd like to invite my sincere colleague, the Dr. Shin-cho, for her presentation regarding the IGS research activity on VLR, Vnr. So, Jo-san, so floor is yours. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Fujino, for the introduction. Thank you, Dr. Fujino, for the introduction. And thank you for inviting me to this very important session on linking VLRs and VNRs. I would like to talk about this topic from the perspective of SDG interlinkages. I will share my screen. So as we know that cities is an open system interacting with various sectors and areas beyond their boundaries through the flows of people, materials, energy, goods, capital, and information. On the one hand, achieving sustainable development in cities will impact on achieving the SDGs at the national level, and on the other hand, national development planning and policies in the context of SDGs will also impact on cities. It is therefore important when we link the VLRs and VNRs, we should take into full account of the intrinsic interlinkages between cities and other SDGs. It is important to understand the SDG interlinkages for integrated policy making. At Aegis,
we developed a methodology to identify, quantify, and analyze the interlinkages between the SDG targets. Identification of the interlinkages between the targets was based on a comprehensive literature review, expert judgments, and stakeholder consultations. And identified SDG interlinkages were then further quantified by using a statistical analysis of the time series data collected for the SDG indicators in 27 countries. We developed an free online tool on SDG interlinkages to help visualize those interlinkages at the target level and provide the national dashboards on SDG synergies and trade-offs. The users can select a country, SDG goals, and relevant targets. And the selected targets and their interlinkages with others can be shown on the screen immediately. Here is an example of expanding public transport in cities in Indonesia related to target 11.2 and its impact on SDGs. By using the tool, we can see that expanding public transport in cities will not only benefit cities, but also the rural population by enabling access to education, to health care facilities, to the workplaces, and other public services. Doing so will help reduce urban-rural gaps, gender inequalities, and other social inequalities. However, such kind of expansion of transport systems can also cause some environmental problems, such as urban air pollution, increase of GHG emissions, and ecological degradation. Therefore, achieving the SDGs in cities cannot be delinked from their impacts either positively or negatively at the national level. So VLR should also include these impacts, particularly related to those how to address the national priority issues. I think this has also been highlighted by previous speakers. I will also look forward to the following panel discussions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jo-san, for your quite interesting presentation for having the supporting the good linkage between VNR and VLR. Okay, so then we have another 20 minutes, yes, and then first I'd like to invite the first two speakers to make comments to the last three speakers, for example, so for like Finland, Sami-san, are you here? So yes, please, yes, have your comments to the speaker, or also you can share your comments. Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Very interesting presentations. But to be short, I would just make two comments. Well, first of all, it was very interesting to hear about Japan's approach on how to organize the work between cities and central government, and what Japan is doing in this respect. It seems to be very systematic, and I believe in Finland we could learn a lot from it. And also, to me, it would be interesting to understand why so many Japanese cities have already made voluntary local reviews. What has inspired cities in Japan to this work more than maybe cities in other countries around the world? And then secondly, in the first presentation, there was the point about central governments more clearly communicating about the voluntary national review to local level, so that it would be easier to integrate voluntary local reviews and voluntary national review. And I think that's a very important point. And we are trying to do that by including the date of our next VNR, so our national implementation plan. So this updated national implementation plan was submitted to the Parliament last month, and in that plan we already announced that our next VNR will take place in 2025. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Finland, Sami-san. So then, Morita-san, do you have any response why there are so many Japanese cities who can conduct the VLR?
Thank you, Fujino-san, and thank you, Mr. Perukara, for the question. I think one of the reasons Japanese local governments are active is that, as I mentioned, we have so-called SDG promotion headquarters, which is led by the Prime Minister. And this headquarters includes all the ministries, which is one of them is in charge of local revitalization. And this office encourages all the local governments to take actions on the SDGs through many initiatives. And one of them is so-called SDG Future City. And by this initiative, many local governments apply to the office every year, and the government choose about 30 cities every year. And the central government gives support, kind of financial assistance to about 10 cities, which is about 30 million yen. Yeah. So this it might be also an incentive for probably some local governments. But at the same time, now the SDG is growing more popular than the past in Japan. So many local governments are interested in implementing the SDGs. And another reason I should mention here is, I think, thanks to the efforts to promote VLRs, IGES is supporting some cities to draft their VLRs. So as you know, it needs efforts to draft such as very complicated and thick reports. So it is very helpful if some organization or someone could help to draft the report. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Morita-san, for your very kind word to IGES. And actually, Kataoka-san, who is MC, she is a leading person to having such a VLR reporting. And also, prior to the SDG, the Future City, we had a Future City program. I was a committee member of Future City program, and also we selected the 11 cities. So in Japan, there is such system to kind of vertical, but is a kind of a good competition among the cities to having the better planning and implementation. So it may be good sometime for other country to try such a system. Thank you. Also, I'd like to thank you, Morita-san. So I'd like to ask the UNSCAP Sami-san to your response to the Finland Sami-san's comment.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, I mean, this is, I believe, for Asia Pacific particularly, where now there's a growing interest from cities to conduct a VLR. This applies a lot, and it's very interesting to see how Finland has already incorporated within the National Implementation Plan. And it would be something that we also encourage governments in the region to pursue further, because we see right now that there is a lot of interest coming from local governments. National governments are slowly sort of warming up to the idea of voluntary local reviews, supporting their local governments, and then maybe sort of moving on to thinking about how this could be integrated further with the VNRs. So yes, what we are focusing on from our end is I mentioned earlier that there are 8 pilot cities that we hope to support with the VLR process going forward. We have a couple of cities, actually 3 cities from Malaysia and Thailand. And Malaysia and Thailand, as we know, are also going to be submitting their second VNR in 2021. So it would be interesting to see how the 2 cities from Malaysia, as well as the 1 city from Thailand, really work together with their national governments and try to integrate the VLR and the VNR as much as possible.
Yes, thank you, Sami-san. So it's quite interesting how the Finnish government can support such as Thailand or Malaysia to having a better VLR, VNR in case for the good timing. Yeah, thank you very much. So then next I'd like to invite Eduardo who having comment to the presentation by maybe I guess. Thank you.
Very much. Fujino, to give me the possibility to share our opinion. First of all, I would wish to congratulate all the presentations that have been made for the efforts you are doing to support the local governments to be involved in the localization process and in the reporting process. I very much appreciate the 2 countries, the 2 examples that you bring here, both Finland and Japan. You are, also, as I mentioned, one of the examples where there is already a close interlinkages between the national and local process, because you are supporting in different ways cities to be part of the national process. And this is an example for many countries. As I mentioned, cities, local governments, they are only involved in approximately 50% of the countries that are reporting. This is still not enough if we want really to create a whole government and whole society approach to achieve the SDGs. I am very impressed on the analysis of the interlinkages that the colleagues of IGES bring to us, as well as the presentation of Eric Sussman, the first presentation regarding the analysis of the multi-level governance in federal states. Sure, we are very attentive on this debate, and for us, the development of this issue is an opportunity, I will say, a lever to improve the multi-level governance, dialogue, collaboration, coordination between all the different levels of governments. Then the question of what are the methodologies to do that for us is critical. As I mentioned, it is a question of, first of all, that national planning integrate also subnational plans, and what the colleague from UNESCAP mentioned, how the process is not only top-down, but also bottom-up, how the two new levels can dialogue and integrate, feed one onto the other. And for that, national government should promote a budgetary approach that can be facilitate the integration of the SDGs at the national budget, but also at the local budgets. And the question of future cities, as how we can create incentives, hours recognition, to really mobilize local governments to be involved in this process. Then their discussion for me was very rich, and I really interested to continue to exchange with all of you on this. We are going to develop our report next year, and the information Japan is reporting next year. And as I mentioned to Fernando, I would very much appreciate any information you can send to us to integrate what local governments in Japan are doing in the next report from local governments to the HLPS. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Edgar, for your question. Also, very much good to the invitation for our collaboration. So first, I'd like to invite Jo-san, and then Jo-san, also you can touch on our also current very latest contribution to the UN Habitat Global Urban Monitoring Framework too. So Jo-san first, please.
Thank you, Dr. Fujino. Recently, the UN Habitat initiated a kind of work on development of the global monitoring framework for achieving sustainable development in cities and edges. We also contributing to that process as a team member of the task force. Actually, the monitoring framework tries to highlight not only the goal 11, which are achieving sustainable, resilient cities, but also including other SDG targets related to cities and the commitments under the new urban agenda. As I also highlighted in the presentation, that cities link with many sectors and many places beyond their boundaries. So these interlinkages should not be overlooked in the linkage between the VLR and VNRs. And also, in many cases, the national development planning or policies may also have unequal kind of impacts on different regions. For example, the conservation of natural resources or the water source in some upstream areas may constrain the economic development or activities in that areas, but benefit the downstream. And sometimes these kind of unequal effects across the regions were not really taken into account in the national policy making. And in linking the VLR and VNRs, actually, VLR can also highlight those kind of specific impacts from the national SDG planning and implementation. And also the impacts from achieving a sustainable development at cities on other regions or at the national level should be included. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jo-san. Also, I'd like to invite my colleague, Eric, and also please respond to the comments from the audience. So how do you foresee the recent US election result affecting Vnr, VLR? It's a question to you too. So over to you.
Okay. So thank you very much, Fujino-san, and all of the presenters. Before I address that question dead on, I'd like to just make a few quick remarks about the content of the session. First of all, I'd like to say that, I found it an incredibly rich session with very useful examples of, for instance, what's happening in Finland and what's happening in Japan. I liked very much the fact that colleagues are emphasizing, as I sort of raised in my presentation too, that this linkage between VNR and VLR is not just something that requires a vertical dimension, but there's also very much working across different issues and working with multiple stakeholders. I think those dimensions are important for this vertical dimension to work effectively. And then the last point I'd like to highlight, which I think is a question that I think all countries are going to need to address as we think about these linkages, is really this funding issue and this fiscal issue. This was implied a little bit in some of the presentations. For instance, Japan is offering some financial incentives for future cities to implement the SDGs. But I think we need to think really carefully about how resources get allocated down to the local level to help implement some of these new ambitious initiatives. Some of this will require realigning existing budgeting processes. But I think if we really want to achieve the SDGs, we really need to think about transformation, not only in this interlinkage issue, but the transformation in these fiscal issues. So those are some points that came to mind during the discussion. Now, for the US example, So in terms of the United States election, so let me be straight up and direct. I think first of all, I think Biden has won the election, and I don't think that's so controversial. But there are some that still feel that this is not the case. The second point is I think it's really salient to highlight that in his first two speeches, one prior to the Associated Press's confirmation of the election, and then after, he highlighted climate change as a critical issue, and he also highlighted some of the equity issues as critical issues. So I think what's going to be very interesting to see now is how he carries through on this and how countries move forward. How cities move forward with some of these perhaps changes in policy. And one of the interesting things to note in this connection, of course, is, as Kataoka-san mentioned at the beginning, the first city to do a VLR. Correct me if I'm wrong, and this was New York City. Is that correct? Yeah, it's New York City, right? So you have some, despite the fact that over the past 4 years, the federal government in the United States has been not so supportive of sustainability objectives. You have some very interesting local initiatives, and I mean, New York is perhaps the highest profile one, but not the only one by any means. So one of the questions then will be is how does the U.S. move forward with this VNR process? And then to come forward, I think one of the key elements is really going to be, and this is sort of echoing the point that I raised at the beginning, is how do we manage these fiscal reforms in ways that will reallocate resources to local governments to handle, as I was mentioning before, sometimes these unfunded mandates. I think, New York can perhaps handle working on SDGs itself, although the pandemic is creating obviously tensions there. But many of these well-resourced cities, this is not as much of an issue. But when we look to sort of smaller cities or cities in the Rust Belt, cities that are losing out on jobs and whatnot, then it's going to require really looking at our budgeting and fiscal processes to see what will work. And I think that's going to be important to spreading the SDGs at the local level in the U.S. and other parts of the world. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eric, for having the very to respond to very hot topics. Thank you so much. So last 1 minute, and then there is the last question. There may be 2 steps: reporting and review for this VNR and VLR, and who are responsible for undertaking for reporting and review. And sorry, so then my answer is that basically national government or local government are in charge of the reporting, also sometimes reviewing. But if the stakeholder want to having reporting or review, I think it is also one of the ways to having the understanding how the government or national government, local government can take SDGs in good manner. So, but this issue we can continue to discuss, I think, by the real lessons. And so hopefully we can continue this discussion. UNDESA also organize a training session or a workshop. Also UCLG, I believe you will have the session. So, and then Finland government may help the Asia Pacific countries when we have a VNR development, maybe also to Japan. Japan may have next VNR next year or next year, I don't know. But so let's continue this discussion for how a better, very good VNR VR linkage. And so I'd like to thank to all the panelists. Thank you very much. And then I will bring my mic to my colleague Kataoka-san. So over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Fujino-san, and then thank you very much for all distinguished speakers and my colleagues to have a good presentations. I think this session is very informative, and then also we would like to continue to work with all the stakeholders and also the speakers here. So we'd like to explore more how the VLR can be linked with VNR effectively, and then also we'd like to explore how we can do the horizontal integrations, and then also the across the sectors, which are now managed rather, the separately. So for the achievement of the SDGs. So thank you very much for participants for your questions and also the questions. And then I would like to continue the collaboration with all stakeholders. I just want to contribute to the discussion that on this topic. So thank you very much for the all speakers for your contribution again. I would like to close this session. Thank you very much.